Is the sound okay? Or is it too loud? Okay, good. So I'm a bit nervous. I haven't done this since 2019, before the pandemic, just so everyone knows. It's also a way for me to get some of the nervousness out by saying that. So yeah, this is my talk. Like, I realized that the title is a bit long, but it's basically, you know, about the game jamming and prototyping. So before we get started, I figure I would tell you a little bit about myself. Currently working at EA DICE as a lead environment artist. And for the past 5 years, I've been working on the Battlefield franchise. Currently working on the third one. And before that, I was working within VR on Apex Construct, not to be confused with Apex Legends, which many people confused it with on release. And then prior to that, I was working at Horizon, the first Horizon game. And that was also kind of where I started my first big gig in the industry. And then I also added the Solus project because that's how I actually got my first internship, and that was a long-distance internship, so I wasn't actually in the place. And I started my journey in the game industry at Uppsala University, and that's back when most of the game education didn't really have split tracks, so most of my bachelor was about game design, and then eventually I got interested in 3D, and that's when I moved on to study it a little bit more in depth at Future Games. So that's a little bit about my career. So the talk today is divided in 4 sections. We're going to talk about foundation, style choice, phases, and then it's just some quick tips and tricks for the jam itself. It's going to start with the foundation then, and well, game jam and prototyping is all about finding the fun quick. This is also a chance for you to try something new while you're at it, compared to when you're in a full production or like later stage of a production. Then it becomes a bit harder to do some experimentation because you're already set on what product you're supposed to deliver. So the prototype basically sets the base of what your game will be about, and that's how you can utilize a game jam as well. Many games that you do during a game jam, you're getting like fun and quick experiments, then they can be the seed to become something bigger and new. So that's why I put this in here, like focus on your game's unique aspect. I want to show you a few examples about games that are thinking a little bit outside of the box. First one is one of my old favorites, Katamari. If you haven't played it, it's basically a game where you roll up objects to create a bigger and bigger ball, and eventually you create planets and stars with it. And like the story is just that King Cosmo got drunk and destroyed the planets, and now it's your job to replace the planets and stars with objects from Earth, because Earth was spared for some reason. The next one is Splatoon. And this is what I would like to call a twist. It's a shooter, so nothing really unique there, but they added a twist in here, like a play on like what a normal shooter would be, where you're still playing different teams, team versus team, but you paint ink, like squid ink, which helps you, like it's a fun game mechanics. You get faster, you can also interrupt the other player team. So it's like a fun little twist that you can add on something that is fairly common. And then Boktai. This is a play on hardware more than anything else. It's actually quite unique in that aspect. It was like a game for Game Boy Advance. You tilt the Game Boy to get and gather sunlight, and that is charging your mechanics or like your abilities in game. So depending on how much sunlight you get, the more powerful you are. So that's like just a way of using hardware, and Nintendo did that a lot with the first Nintendo DS as well, where they used the microphone and just like how you could clasp together the hardware. So one of the games that I myself had a lot of time was a survival game. I had a lot of fun with it. You were blowing into the mic to create fires, and they had some puzzle elements where you had to put sheets of paper together, and you did that by just closing your DS, and that's how you solve the puzzle. So small inventions like that with the hardware is also like something one can play with. And the last one is more a play on just being odd. So this is basically a life simulator. It's called Seaman. It was for Sega. So it's not really unique because there's a lot of life simulators out there, but there is a Japanese man's face on a fish. And eventually this fish grows up and crawls up on land, and well then you're done because well now it's happy and free, and then you start over. So this is more odd than unique, but it's still making your game stand out. So with this example, I want to show like Katamari with the mechanics, Splatoon with like a twist on something that is not like that unique in itself as a shooter, Boktai with the hardware, and Seaman that is just being odd. But this is all about finding the core of your project. And even as an artist, this is something one has to think about and keep in mind all the time, that it's adherent and staying connected to what the core of the game is. Because this like foundation you create is the core of your project. And there is like different way one can tackle this, but for a game jam and a prototype, I like to divide it into 4 sections. And this is also not meant to be a book as I wrote. It's more like a quick draft that you make, and you can expand on this later, but it's supposed to be high-level pointers. So these are the 4 steps that I added in here. You can divide it in different ways, but probably some people have heard about pillars at the very least. You can also make pillars in kind of anything. In the beginning of a project, it's usually game design pillars, but for a jam, I will call it more like the overall pillars. That's what I will work with. It's like touching base on like anything you're making for the game rather than just focus on the gameplay. And then you have tone and setting as well. It's just like a way of going deeper and deeper into what was your core values. But for a game jam, it's enough to just focus on the core values and the pillars. There's no need to like dwell deeper, but we're going to cover them anyway if one likes to do that. So the core values, like, there's a bit of what we already talked about. It's like about finding the uniqueness with your game. What is it about? Themes and emotion. Anything that you can think about that you want the player to experience when you're playing. So you write a few sentences about this, like anything that comes to mind. And this becomes the foundation part of your pillars. And as I mentioned before, you can make pillars in anything, but for this it's better to focus on just the overall ones. Like later down in the project, like we usually in art have art direction pillars, and then you can delve deeper into that, and there's like sound pillars as well, like depending on the themes as well. But I will start like looking at the core values, brainstorm a few ideas for each of the sentences you made. They should be describing each aspect. But then you go in and refine them. 3 to 5 strong pillars align with the core values. But for a jam, like keep it small. There's no need to add a lot of the pillars. It's better to just do like 1 or 2. I would recommend 3 because it then at least becomes a little bit more context to it. And then you do a definition pass on it. So every pillar should be clear, concise, and easy to understand, and use keywords. But the important point here is that the entire team understands what the pillars are about. So don't go and use like fancy wording that no one will understand. That's not the point. The point is that everyone in the team understands what they're set out to do, because everyone will be working on different things on the game. So an example then with one of my favorite games, Katamari. And this is not the official pillars, it's just a breakdown I made myself. I think one of the pillars, at least overall pillars, is chaos. And that is like the description for that, like very short, would be what is happening. But it doesn't mean like it should be random. It should be a orderly chaos within everything, the character, dialogue, level, sound, and style. but a red thread across everything. And the second one is playground. And the reason why I chose playground is because it's not really a sandbox. A sandbox is something you say when it's an open world and you can do anything. Katamari still has restrictions even though it's a playground. They have like a lot of hurdles, like you can become like bigger and bigger, but you still can't roll up objects that are larger than you. You need to grow big enough to roll up the next objects. And then the third one is hoard. So it's just basically collect everything and anything. That's the premises and the base of Katamari. And it's also like going into then collecting gameplay objectives, new characters, abilities, and just as a last one I wrote anything, but it's still tied to the middle pillar where you have the restriction of objects that are larger than you can't roll up because you need to achieve that objective first. So if the pillars are the interaction a player has with the game, the tone is more now a player perceives the game. So pillar can also be what the player experience. It's just a matter of how much detail like to dive into them, and if you want to categorize it more as game design pillars or overall pillars, art direction pillars, and so on. But the idea is that the tone should help you to do a continuation of your pillars. And this is something then that might not be needed for a game jam, but it can help you set some of the foundation for content creation. So again, Katamari, which is whimsical and playful, humorous dialogue, and again the odd story with King Cosmos being drunk and destroying the solar system. It's also quirky and eccentric characters. So that is the whimsical and playful tone. And then you have chaotic and surreal, and again I used the word chaotic, and it's because it should be like a red line and just dwelling more into details. And it's again touching on like you rolling up all sorts of objects and becoming like increasing your size, but it's also a bit unpredictable because you can collect various sorts of objects that doesn't really match. It's not like small cubes. It can be very long and cylindrical objects, which means that your Katamari can all of a sudden start going in a different direction than you intended because it has it's not a round shape anymore. And then just absurd worlds and giant creatures and bizarre landscapes. And it's supposed to be positive and uplifting, and this is touching a bit on the music aspect as well, upbeat and energetic music, and lots of colors. So the last one is setting, and this doesn't necessarily just refer to the environment you play in. It's like anything that has to do with like what your setting is for the player. It can be the characters as well. It's the physical space and the time period, as well as the relationship and culture and historical aspect of the game as well. And then for Katamari, these are the three ones, and again, they're not the official ones, so one can think however they want about the game. But the three settings I chosen is familiar and oddworldly elements, and that's because you usually start in a very small room, a corner, and that's very familiar. Everyone knows what it looks like, especially if you're Japanese, and because there's Japanese rooms you start in. But then once you start growing and getting bigger and bigger, you're getting out to the city, you get to meet all of these more absurdities. There's like Godzilla, floating islands, mushrooms, and it just becomes more and more bizarre. And then you have colorful and simple, and that's because it's very bold colors. And now we're touching a little bit more about how we want to create the art. It's like Japanese pop culture, minimalism, it's 3D. So here we know it's not a 2D game, it's actually a 3D game. And then I added space. So even if you're not playing in the space itself, space is a big part of the story for Katamari. It's also a big part of the UI, and also in the end, you're actually making stars and planets. So space is there all the time as a theme. It's just that you're not playing in space. It's also part of the gameplay objective. So one of the earliest things you have to do in one of the first games is to make the planet Mercury. And by doing so, you need to make sure that you have enough liquid objects in your Katamari, or the King Cosmos will deem your planet unworthy, and you will have to make a new Katamari that is having more liquids in it. So that is the first section. That's usually how I plan and think about art. So I just don't start diving into art. I actually think about all of these like aspects of the game first, like the overall and how they tie together, and make some rules before actually going into the art planning. It's a good thing to write down these things, and then you keep that in mind throughout the entire like project, and even when you do a prototype. So, second section is more about the art phases. So these are like just some suggestions on how one will be planning these phases. There's like tons of ways of doing this, and then production have their own timelines and methods and so on. But for a art jam, this is what I would go into. I think the slides went a bit ahead of me. That was going to be my point, that even if you plan a lot, time is going to be your constraint. But the point I want to make here is also that you don't do these step by step and you're done. You actually go back as a loop all the time. So you iterate. You start with your references and asset list. You place a block out in the engine. You work in like sections and work iteratively all the time. And then you go back and revise your references and asset list, because you will find out more once you move into the engine and into that space. And a good thinking is that don't be narrow-minded when you're like getting into the actual like production part of creating assets. It's better to get around 50% there on everything, because it will look consistent and coherent, and no one will know actually that you plan on making like, you know, a super realistic game. It's better to make everything look like it was intended and like belong together than going into sections and be like, well, this is now 100% finished and the rest is just a gray box. So the asset list then, I just want to show an example. There's several ways you can do it. This example I have here is more focused on if you're moving in sections, like in iterative progress, it's like dividing the assets into like categories, like do the UV for everything, do the light mapping for everything, the texture for everything. And if you keep yourself accountable to that, you will have all of the content you have to a specific phase. And then if you don't have the time, at least stuff is coherent. But an asset list doesn't need to be in this way. You can do it as, you know, in-depth as you like, or think about it in another way. Like this one is priority-based instead, where it's more like you list everything you need, and you know that, well, we agree in the group that 1 and 2 we're going to make, and if we can't make it by the end of the first day, we're just going to cut the rest. But at least we know then we have the base foundation for the game. And anything else is just a bonus. And you can go even more simple and just use a notepad and list down what you need. But this is still going to be helpful for your teammates in case someone needs to know, going to make sound for all of these things. Or someone maybe want to already place light or do some scripting for some of these things. They're already aware of, you already agree on what's going to make it into the game. And if we're speaking about not really a game jam where you're very limited on time, but you want to make a prototype, I usually go more visual and do visual breakdowns instead of lists. So this is more based on a concept, and you do a breakdown on the concept instead. It's still an asset list in there, but it's more visual. It's also easier when you talk with other people in the team that might not know what you're imagining in your head stuff to be, and then you can show them. So even if you intend for this to be maybe more cartoony, people will still know what you're thinking by just adding more visual. And here you can already start seeing a breakdown on like tiling textures and other things that you want to have. And you can go as detailed as you want in this, or well, as sparse as you like as well with a visual planning. So references then. So when you gather references, it's quite easy to go a bit overboard. I love looking at images myself, and I use Pinterest a lot. And then by the end of it, before you know it, you have like 300 images in there. So it's better to go with quality over quantity. It's easy to drown out there because like, oh, that looks cool and that looks cool. But like, usually that will confuse you and confuse the team more than actually helping. So it's better to use like few images as possible. And you don't need to just go with concepts. You can also just use anything else that inspires you. Like I tend to look a lot of fashion as well because there's cool patterns in there, and that can help me understand how like to achieve a certain pattern, textures, or anything else like the mood in the game. And for organizing, I usually go in and make mood boards. And this is just a take on it. There's various ways of doing it. But if you're, like, this is also in a very early stage of a scene I like to make. So I really love that concept, but it's very blurry. It doesn't really show any details. So what do? So this is like, what I like to do then is to gather my thoughts in a section. So you can see how I added colored dots on everything in the little concept art. So you have like a red, a green, and a blue. And then there's a border, a frame around sections of the board where I'm like, okay, so for the cliffs, I like it to look like this. And then you can use both in-game images from other games or like real photos. And then I add some keywords and like what I'm thinking when I'm seeing it. And then I do this for every section on the image. And you can see that some of them are inconsistent, but this is also a way to get it out of your system. So if you look at the totem poles in the yellow section, they're very different from each other. And that's because I don't really know at this point what I like the totems to be and how they should be designed, if I want them to be tall or small. And this is something I know that I will be able to answer once I get into the engine and see it in like layout and 3D space instead. So I will keep them there, and then I will move on to the blockout section. And then I will go back to my mood board and continuously iterate on this. And this is also where you constantly double check with your initial pillars, and if you have tones and setting, that everything is still consistent and going in that direction that you would like it to go and what you initially agreed on in the team. So I wrote down like a little bit like a list what this is actually helpful with, but you know, it's helpful with anything. It's also like a way of just getting stuff into the engine, and here you already know, okay, I need a lot more things than I initially thought in my asset list. Maybe I need to add this or reshuffle my priority. And people tend to know about this, but they don't do it to the extension that they need. Like you spend a lot of time actually in this stage before you actually move on. So this is like a constant then loop of going back and forth before I move on to the next part of it. And you can use these blockout pieces then and just replace them. So once you have this, then you know and can just move in stages, which is what I would like to show with this image. So once I have my blockout, I start refining the blockout. It's still a blockout, but I'm refining it. And in the second image here, I also have gone into ZBrush and just done some really quick sculpts because it's supposed to be an organic scene. And then I just reduce the triangles so it actually, you know, won't overload the engine. And then I start seeing how the medium shapes are playing, so it's not just blocks, because rocks are quite organic. And then I'm like, oh, okay, so my initial composition didn't actually work. So then I go back into ZBrush, continuously iterate, and the third image is what you see in the engine. And then I continue on to refining the speed model, like a second pass on that. But you can see that I'm doing this with every asset I have in, like, as an intended for my scene. And if I'm at this point running out of time, this is where I stop. But everything is consistent. Like, there's still, like, in the same amount of detail, it has still received the same pass. And you can see that the biggest difference between the second last image and the last one is that I realized I didn't really want to have a gigantic head sticking out that much. I'd rather do it as a relief. And the tree is very blobby, so I started adding branches. So I wanted to have more of that dead look. And then I added some green, because now I can start seeing how I want the colors to have a contrast between each other if the rocks are very gray. But this is totally fine to ship with because it's still like art. I mean, no one else can tell you that, well, you know, that wasn't supposed to be the intended look, because all they would know is that it might have been, because maybe you were striving for this look. So it's still fine then to, you know, call it here, and because everything is the same polish level. So this is the third section. I'm going to talk a little bit about style choice. So we talked a little bit about like stopping at the refinement of the speed model, and this goes into like that stylization comes in a wide range of execution. We can now utilize a lot of modern tech. I mean, we don't really have that much restriction with triangles anymore. You can actually add quite a lot compared to like before. Stylization was more associated with low poly, like constraints. If you couldn't make it realistic, you went with stylization and so on. While realism was more associated with high-end graphics, but that's not the case anymore. You can actually add a lot, and you can also use modern tech to achieve like a really nice-looking game with very little, You don't need to be a master modeler at this point. You can just add some like surface noise or make it like metallic in a shader, and then you already have something that looks pretty good. So in realism, you are very restricted, as everyone knows about like everyday life, reality. There's a reason why we always enhance movies and games. If you compare a movie and been shooting outside here with real life, you will notice that there's a lot of post-process effects. There's a lot of things to enhance that reality, which makes it really hard to achieve realism in a short amount of time, because everyone here has the ability to judge that, well, that doesn't look real. But stylization is more like a play on color and shape. It's more like an expressive method. So that's why I usually suggest that people go with stylization for game jams and prototyping, and don't feel sad about that they can't make realism. There is a way where you don't need to make the assets yourself. There's a lot of libraries and Megascan probably heard about and so on. But it's still harder to achieve that even when using existing assets, because there's more things at play than just having nice looking models. But stylization isn't easy. So I like to break it down into two categories, and this is very broad. It's the exaggerated stylization and minimalistic. So if you look at exaggerated stylization, like Blizzard is well known for that. It's like using shape language quite a lot, like using silhouettes. You still add a lot of details. It's still like a lot of sculpting and medium shapes. There's baked normals usually, like as in Overwatch. So it's not like something that is really quick and easy and fast to make. It is something that requires time to achieve. So one thing that is easier than to go with is the minimalistic approach. It's still like play on shape and silhouettes, and you can be quite expressive with it, but you're limiting yourself to the more broader strokes than the details in a mesh. So with this one, like you can still get the perception, like you can see that in Journey, that it's a desert. Everyone feels like it's a desert because it's orange. It's quite flat. It's like a bit wobbly. Like that is what you also already connect to real life. It becomes a little bit harder to play with minimalistic stylization if you want to go sci-fi with something people can't connect to real world. But if you have some connection points, it still like will read for anyone like that you are playing in the desert, or like in Firewatch in the top one that, well, this is rocks, this is a watchtower, this grass. And you can go even more simplistic than what they have done, and people can still read the environment and feel like they are in the place that you intended to be. So if we think about then translation, you see this a lot in both realistic games and in stylized games. So I chose this example because you can see that it's the same arc, but the details have changed a lot. So it's not a one-to-one replica, and there's various reasons why game developers choose to perhaps not make a one-to-one replica. I can't speak for this game because I didn't work on it, but a lot of the time it can be legal issues, it can be performance restrictions because you want to have tiling textures, it can be content set that needs to be shared with another one, it can be collision issues, you might not want people to climb on those pillars and sit there and so on. But you will still, like when you're playing the game, be reminded about the real life arc, just because it's resembling enough. The brain like recognize patterns. They still have the circular objects, they have the arches where they're supposed to be, even though it's not a one-to-one replica. And you can do this with many things. And I'd like you to look at this example from, there's like a picture of Old Town in Stockholm, and then the other one is photoshopped. So what's been done here is a lot of the smaller details have been removed, but you can still like see and read it as a house, and this could still be a realistic house even though we removed all of the shapes. And to be fair, some houses in Stockholm actually do look like that. And even if the pattern on the roof has been enlarged, there's still like a lot of buildings that have large tiles as well. So this is a way you can remove and emphasize details and play on shapes as well. It's just a matter now if you're gonna choose to go with realistic surface noises and material definition, or if you want to go more stylized. And if you want to go even more stylized than this, then you start emphasize and remove shapes even more. And this is just another example from the Apex Construct game we worked on. It was supposed to be set in Stockholm. So this is like the gondol, it's like an elevator and a sky bridge in Stockholm. And a lot of people recognized it and thought it was that exact place, but they look completely different. It's just that people still recognize the shape of the building, but a lot of like the trademarks and things that you can't put in a game because you don't want to infringe on copyrights and stuff has been removed. And you can go even more stylized than this, like we added logos and stuff, but you can just go flat out with colors. So a lot of the shapes in here has been simplified as well, because it's also VR, so a lot of jitter and noise is not really readable. But it's still like something you can read as this sky bridge. So, just want to show you this comparison also from that game, that in the beginning it looked like this minimalistic stylization, and it was also one of the like very early intention for it to just like polish that, and then that will be the look of the game. But then we changed the direction. So this goes back to like if you already have everything in the game and in the engine, it's just a matter of iterating and replacing what you have. So it's still the same scene, it's still a gigantic metallic head. It's still like the depths, like the big pool of like nothingness underneath. The background has changed. That's kind of the only change that happened. But the rest is still like in the same spot. Because this is also what we play tested the game in, so we didn't really want to change it, but then we took another art pass on it. But you can still release the game in that minimalistic style and it will be fine, and a lot of games do as well. So you don't need to take it in an extra pass, but you can if you have the time. So this is another example if you just look at an asset. You have a semi-realistic stump, and then you have a stylization take on it, and then you have the minimalistic take on it. So this is from another talk of mine that I had, just added the minimalistic one in here, where a lot of the shapes have been removed in the minimalistic one, because there's a lot more noise in the silhouette on the more realistic one. You can go even more realistic here and be like more hyper-realistic, but this is more like a semi-realism, or people still call it realism. And you can see how just the pattern and the texture changed, and even if the wood dye is gone on that stump, you still see the inner exposure with just a color, and the outer layer of that bark with a darker brown color. So it's still the same, and you don't need to exaggerate shape as well. Like many times you do exaggerate the shape in stylization, but you don't necessarily have to. This is still like a minimalistic style. And the last one before we move into the last section, I just want to show you that you can do this on the very, very small objects as well, where you have a realistic mandarin, and then you have a stylized one. And this is how you then can continuously break it down. They're both using PBR, they're both having roughness maps, but the shape in the roughness map for the stylized one have changed to be a more larger pattern compared to the realistic one. It's the same in the normal. So you keep what you think is the iconic part of an object, and then you either emphasize, remove, or just simplify the shapes and colors and so on in your objects. And then you can continuously doing this both like more stylized and even more hyper-realistic. So this is the last section of the talk, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth of minimalism. So the few examples I have here is the same mesh, again, like it's the same car model on the top, and the only difference is that I'm playing with metallic. So the last one from my left, I guess, has full metallic. That's it. That's the main difference. And then there's some of these cars, see if you can spot it, that has metallic on certain parts. And then there's one of these cars that has no metallic whatsoever. It's just the colors. It's like a subtle change, but it still impacts the look of your game. So if you have a lot of non-metallic objects and you suddenly turn full metal on another, it will still change the look and feel and how you perceive the game. And the bottom one, you have simple boxes, and of course you can model in the planks instead, because a lot of low poly styles, they model the planks they want to have and then decide if they want to have more or less planks as well. But this is the same box where I used to play with the texture and then the roughness and metal. So you can see on this side it's just plain colors. The bottom row is wood, and then the top one is like wood and metal. And on the furthest one, like you can see it's the same box, but it has only metal added to it and roughness. So that's like with no textures, and you can see how it changes the light. And then you have the middle box, which is the traditional old school hand-painted style where you add in light information. But there is nothing else, it's just painted light. So when you can see how it shifts in hue all the time on how you perceive it with the lighting going over. And the like second to last one has the same texture as the second box, but with added roughness on it. So you can create a lot of variation and like styles within your game by just using very few like inputs and parameters. So swatch modeling and gradient modeling is something like it's quite common to use. And that is just like using the simple colors that we've been doing. And this is a site that is called Lockspec. It's usually mostly used by 2D artists. And this is where you can create a color palette, or you can just download color palettes from here. So you can constrain your color palette with something, because you know there's quite cool images, and you'll be like, yeah, well, I want that one. That's kind of the style of my game. And use it when you're 3D modeling as well. So it's an easy way for you to like choose a color palette based on just someone else, or if you don't want to make the color swatches yourself, you can just get one from here. So what do I mean when I talk about swatch modeling? I'm just going to play a video here for those who doesn't know. So this is just an arch that I'm going to move the UV, like in the UV space. I think the mic died for a second. Yeah. And you can see how it changes color based on where it is in the UV space. And you can also use regular swatches to make a gradient by scaling it down, because you will get a mip-map effect, which is just basically a low res in between the colors. So that's a way you can play with gradients without making a gradient map itself. But that will be a limitation on like where you put the colors then. So if you would like to go with more colors, it's going to be harder with this type of method. As you see here, you won't get that gradient. It will more look like a lollipop. So then I recommend going more the gradients, and that's what you see in the bottom image, where you just have a more like a range of the same color, that you can get that range in it as well, and you can swap it out, of course, to go between other gradients. Now, the gradient map I have here is just showing like the same color in one range, but you can go with how many like rainbow colors you like with the gradient, and you can just move your objects up and down in here and create some hue effects and so on. So it's quite simple. You don't need to know how to UV map, just to make a projection, and then you're done basically. See if I can move to the next slide. So the next one then that I would like to talk about is something called normal angle. It's sometimes called smoothing group, soft and hard edges, many different names for the same thing. So there's no need really to bake normal maps when you need to work fast. You can just have either low poly object or a little bit more triangles, and then you play with the normal on it. So just because you want to go with low poly style doesn't mean that it needs to look very squarish. You can still play with the normal angles of the object, and you can see here how it goes from very polygonal to very smooth. So myself, I like the look of the arch a bit more when it's somewhere in between, but that's how you can create more shape definition in your arc. And this is the same arc you saw to the right, but it's just changing the light on it. And then you can also play a lot with the light, like color of lights. You don't need to go in and do this swatch modeling. If you really don't know how to UV map, you can play with the lighting instead. You can also see how the some of the shapes on the arc is disappearing if you have a very harsh light angle. So you need to be careful with this as well, even if it's a good way of like lighting a scene, especially in caves or in a constrained room. It gets a bit more difficult when it's an open area, but you can still then emphasize the shapes you have in here with just using your mesh and the light. So just to show a comparison how that works with the more realistic looking objects, you can see that even here, if you have a very harsh light or angle, you get an emphasis in the medium details, like the texture and where the normal is, and you can flush them out as well. So then all of that details you put in can actually kind of disappear. So it's quite important to know what the light settings and stuff will be for your environment early on when you do the block out, because otherwise you risk losing a lot of that work you put into the modeling. And here's the same just with the stylized object instead. And you can also see how that, if you change the light to be a bit more harsh, like the red image or white, you lose a lot of that brown color as well. So light can be a really powerful way to get colors in your scene and mood, but it can also destroy your scene. So the last example, this is a Unity pack scene, but I think it shows the like if you have an open environment quite well. You can see that a lot of the objects that you have in here are yellow, and the environment itself is gray, so you have a huge contrast. And the important things that you're going to collect are the red apples. And you can notice how you see still the colors in the more bland lighting condition, and how the initial color palette you had just disappears by adding a harsher lighting condition. So that's why it's really cool way of coloring your environment, but it can also flush it out if you're not careful. And for the final part, I want to show a few videos. So the same arc, the car and stuff like that again. So this is used to show that the light that you have and the way you color your things change a lot, and also just how high and density your objects are. So this is the wireframe. So you can see that there's quite a lot of geometry on that arc. There's not that much color information going on. And then you add light. And the light here is not, I removed the black shadows as well to have a softer shadow. So it becomes a bit more softer transition in between there. So you can play with the color of the shadows as well. And then you can use post-process effects like this video here. If you want to put some, like, make it more cartoony, you can put down some lines. You see how it changes the river with that cross like pattern that you barely notice without the lines. By just emphasizing that, and everything gets this more cartoony black outline. It's also quite easy to do in a shader. You don't need to be a master like shader artist. You can just get that by changing some parameters. So same scene again, but you're doing everything red. So this is a way to put some mood in there. So these things are I just want to show that the same scene and the same assets, you can get a different look on it, depending on the post-process you use, the lighting, and there's other ways you can play with the camera. Say you want to have a heat effect, just add some wobbling in there, or maybe this could work for an underwater scene as well. It's very simple methods to add to the feeling of your game as well. And the last one, if it wants to change, is everything all at once. So you have now red cartoony outlines and the wobbly effect, and now you start going into like a little bit more crazy art style as well. So it's quite simple to get something that is quick but still looks good. This is a Unity shader. You can see that the same object can take very many different shapes. So imagine you having a game and then you have the shader on everything, how that will look and feel. I think this shader is quite cool because there's so many different options, and it's just the same object in the same color, but you can still make a huge impact on the final style. So to summarize, if you take all of the points and sections we went through, focus on what makes your game unique and quirky and standing out, whether that's like with unique game mechanics, or if it's just being odd, or if you have any ways you can play with hardware, or just making a twist on something. Try to use planning tools. You don't need to go in and do a deep dive into anything, but a lot of these things are going to help you stay on track and make sure that the team understand the vision as well. I mean, these are still helpful if you're doing a solo jam. And then iterate and make sure that you land in something that is consistent and coherent, and even if it wasn't the intended vision, you will still be able to deliver something that looks and feels finished for your game. So that was it.